Alright, let's continue our quest for trigger enlightenment and talk more deeply about the trigger loop. You need to have a thorough understanding of what it is, why it's used, and how it works. This is an example of the trigger loop. It might look familiar to you because we used the same loop in the trigger we just wrote. But the trigger loop isn't just specific to our previous trigger. Every trigger you write will use a trigger loop. You might remember from our former trigger that the code inside the trigger loop contained all of our main and important logic. In this case, I have replaced that block of code and added 4 lines of comments instead. In Salesforce, you can add comments to your code by preceding your text with 2 slashes. Comments are often used to describe what your code is doing in plain English, without having to worry about any impacts on actual logic. For the sake of this explanation, let's pretend our comments are actual lines of code. Back to our trigger loop. The top and bottom lines of code here comprise our trigger loop. Everything inside its scope are the lines of code that will be repeated for each iteration in our loop. This type of loop is known as a for each loop. It's called a for each loop because it repeats everything inside its scope for each record inside its list. In this case, the list is trigger.new. What is trigger.new? I'm glad you asked. Trigger.new is the list of all records entering a trigger. Whether your trigger is on leads, accounts, contacts, custom objects, or whatever, trigger.new will always be the list of records entering your trigger. This is so important for you to know that it gets its own slide. Back to our trigger loop. So trigger.new is the list of records entering our trigger. Awesome. Lead here is the type of records that we'll be iterating across. And L is a variable that we'll be temporarily assigning to our loop's current iteration's record. The variable L will be available inside the scope of our loop, and we inevitably will need to use it. Since L is a variable, we could have called it anything we wanted to. Here we use camel case again to name this variable to myLead instead. For variables, it's common practice to leave the first letter as lowercase. We could have also called L Taylor Swift instead, but that wouldn't be very descriptive. Again, back to our trigger loop. Let's see how Salesforce executes this loop. First, Salesforce is going to take the first record in trigger.new and assign it to our lead variable L. With L available to use inside our loop, Salesforce will then execute each line inside our trigger loop one by one. Once all lines inside the loop are executed, Salesforce will then take the next record in trigger.new and assign it again to variable L, overriding L's previous assignment. Once again, Salesforce will then execute every line of code inside our loop one by one. This process repeats itself for however many records there may be in trigger.new.